Let's get going. Supposedly, people are coming in. Sorry, I'm running a little bit late here. My name's Kay Dickerson, and I'm the chair of this session. I didn't bring my agenda up with me, but Mark Helfand is going to be talking to us about the incorporation by PCORI of patient stories into methodology standards, which some of you were involved in as peer reviewers. And we're lucky to be hearing from him today because a lot of what he'll be talking about directly and indirectly pertains to our work. So you have the speaker bios, and we're, as I think Angina or Lorraine said, we aren't going to be spending a lot of time introducing you, but Mark is currently located at the Oregon VA and OHSU, and read more about him. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, like Peter, I got a title from Kay and then tried to make a talk around it. And I will do that. I'll actually talk about this. But a couple of things in the discussions up till now, because I have the podium, I couldn't resist a few comments on them. One of them about the learning health system, and in the course of that panel, somebody said learning health system, somebody said something about observational studies, and Peter even put up a slide, the top of which was the Medtronic Yale thing. So I actually did one of, my group analyzed the data that Medtronic provided to Yale about the product RHBMP2, which was a biologic that's used to make back surgery go without a bone graft. And it was interesting because in addition to the Medtronic studies, which we had the original data for, we were asked to review anything else we found in the literature. And most of what we found in the literature were observational studies where somebody says, we did 200 of these cases and this percent of people came up with this side effect, and that surprised us because we've been doing surgery like this for years, but we haven't ever seen 3% come up with this. It's been, 1 out of 10,000. So really not real control groups, although maybe historical controls. And so my team was working very hard on trying to rate the quality of these studies, and they are very experienced systematic review people. And so they rated the quality of these studies really poorly, really bad. Most of them they said were poor quality. And after we talked it over, we distinguished some of those studies from what I would call real learning health systems, where you're not wasting data all the time. You're following, you're monitoring your practice, you're figuring out what is going on and what the rates are. In the same study, a 3-month sample of everybody who had this surgery, basically a series, in a system like that, where they've spent years tracking and auditing their tracking of complications, to me meant a whole lot more than a 3-month study from a practice that just decided to suddenly look at stuff and we don't know the context of how that system, the health system they practice in, uses data or respects data. And so we ended up saying that, that context of being in a learning health system and one that actually tries to use data in order to improve practice could really boost the credibility of these studies about adverse events, whereas it doesn't really appear in the rating system that way. The rating systems for systematic reviews, in my humble opinion, need to be sort of changed to take into account the sort of culture of data within the health system that the studies are being done in. But that has nothing or very little to do with what I'm talking about today. So I am talking about PCORI, and I'm on the methodology committee of PCORI, and I know you all know all about PCORI, and I've heard already this morning several people say why PCORI and comparative effectiveness emerged in terms of, in various ways. And one way to put it is that it emerged because there was a lack of good information, particularly randomized trials, comparing alternative treatments, making it hard to apply research to patients' decisions. And as Nancy Cass said earlier, you could say, well, A and B are common alternatives, been around for 20 years. No study, yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's funny they haven't really compared those things. And so part of the rationale for PCORI was to get to it and compare the things that no other funders seem to have motivation to have funded before, that make a difference to patients in the choices or the decisions they make. And I wanted to start out just by saying what an important role systematic reviews have played historically in bringing us to recognize that that was a situation that we should try to remedy. That is the mismatch, somebody used the word, I think Nancy used the word mismatch, between the information patients and clinicians need and the information research produced. And so I dug up some slides that I think I wrote in 2002, saying that, systematic reviews, these slides were done in the context of the drug evaluation program in Oregon and other states 12 or 14 years ago. And systematic reviews brought this question to attention. What's the kind and strength of the evidence you're relying on to make a decision? And we used, the definition we used of evidence-based at that time was something based on a comprehensive, systematic, open-minded review of all the evidence. The evidence determines the conclusion, not vice versa, not the citation of papers supporting a preformed conclusion and trashing papers that don't, and not the use of evidence when it's positive and judgment when it isn't. And that's pretty, well accepted now. Then we talked a little bit back then about what makes something systematic. There's systematic reviews are systematic to remove bias in finding and reviewing the literature. But we also said this, that a systematic review should use a process for selecting and refining questions that put patients' and clinicians' concerns center stage. That, again, was what we said. Now, I wish we had said caregivers. Forgive me. But we can't, I didn't want to historically revise and go back and throw that in there. And so this is something that I wrote about the Oregon program we had, that our premise is that important questions arise from practice and from life, and that we use citizen panels to put patients' and providers' concerns center stage, and that the results of the process illustrated how the evidence people need to make decisions and the evidence researchers provided is often a mismatch. So that is the mismatch. So that experience with systematic reviews, not just us, but across the board, brought attention to this fact that, the review of an important question, studies really haven't directly addressed that question for various reasons. And that is a strong part of the rationale of PCORI. Now, the PCORI Methodology Committee was established as part of the legislation, and its main role was to develop standards for conducting comparative effectiveness research. Or to put it differently, find ways in which we could make sure that the learning that we get out of this research was credible and that it was done as quickly as possible so that it would be timely. And that is the other, aside from this rationale about the mismatch and trying to do direct comparison studies, that is another big part of the rationale for the PCORI part of the legislation, which is that most research, or much research, wasn't very credible. And earlier there was a discussion about, sort of data mining retrospective data. On the methodology committee, here's how I think I viewed the problem. I can't speak for everyone on the committee. Everybody at PCORI Methods Committee might have a different view. But most of us agreed that most of the time retrospective analysis of data sets gives the wrong answer, most of the time. That if you try to think, when have randomized trials really steered us wrong? There are examples, celebrated examples, where a big randomized trial had a different answer than the small ones and it changed everything. But it's a lot harder to come up with examples of where randomized trials steered us really wrong than to come up with examples of where retrospective and even prospective observational studies steered us way, way wrong and a randomized trial fixed it. And some of those classic examples, like arrhythmias, drugs for arrhythmia, where essentially you had these fantastic results in observational studies and a randomized trial showed that the drugs that were widely used were actually harmful. You have to think about this. The investigators doing those studies, did they drop out of school in the third grade? No. These were all, senior or qualified investigators, but coming up with the wrong answer. And so that focuses you on the methods they used. And I think the general sense of the methodology committee standards is, to kind of raise the bar to strengthen observational studies and to strengthen trials. But a lot of the standards are aimed at saying, how can we get better answers out of these kind of analyses, instead of just throwing out the baby with the bathwater and saying, it's hopeless, let's just do trials. Now, that said, in the course of deliberating about these standards, dealing with some relatively arcane or esoteric methodologic issues regarding the conduct of studies, statistical issues, study design issues that are generally thought to be the realm of methodologic specialists, statisticians, and so on. It came up, at least some methodology committee members said, that they thought it was important to find a way to show that methods matter to patients, or should matter to patients, and that what we were talking about, if we spent a day deliberating about what statistical methods are best for handling missing data, patients who don't complete studies, that somebody might say, well, that has nothing to do with patient-centeredness, has nothing to do with the patient's experience. And actually that we felt that's not true. That changing the way that you handle missing data from for lack of a better word, I'll say a bad way to do it, to a good way to do it, makes a real difference in people's lives. Because because the literature will give you a different impression if you do these things wrong. And so anything PCORI tried to do in the area of choosing the right questions and comparisons could be undermined by research methodology that at least didn't meet this bar. And so they thought that that's one thing they wanted to do, and the other thing they wanted to do is to go far beyond that and saying that, patient-centeredness and attention to the details of how the evidence is generated and how well conducted the research is are strongly linked. Patient-centeredness is strongly linked to being evidence-based, to paying attention, as we do in systematic reviews, to the design and conduct of studies. And finally, the methodology committee, and probably most importantly, felt that it wasn't enough for us to say that we wanted the patient's voice in research, that we had to go and demonstrate that researchers can and should listen to patients in the design and conduct of research. What's 2? 2 minutes left. Okay. So what we did was we set up a set of criteria for selecting stories, patient stories, to go with the methodology report. We said they should be credible, they should be memorable, they should be in the first or third person, they should be free of bias in that they don't promote a specific product or company, and they should have narrative completeness. And that the aims of having the stories in there would be to demonstrate that methodology matters, to show that PCORI and the methodology committee can listen to patients, and to show how researchers can turn stories into hypotheses. And I wanted to say a word about these last parts of these aims. PCORI's brought a ton of attention to the idea of engagement and to the idea of the patient's voice in research. But it's one of these things where, you could be very engaged. Let's talk about the doctor-patient relationship for a second and say, you could be going to a physician for something, and they could be listening very carefully and engaging very well. But maybe they didn't really listen in med school or since then, and they have no idea what to do. They're not bringing you any technical knowledge of how to turn your concerns, complaints, symptoms, findings into some choices or plans. And by that analogy, that's what could happen, we thought, with research, is that we can put the patient's voice in the middle of it. We can have researchers go and try to be engaged and get these things, but turning that into real changes in how they conduct and design studies is not necessarily, it's not something we can take for granted. And so we deliberately said, we didn't tell you what to think about these stories, but we put them in there with the idea that, now how would a researcher who wanted to be engaged and wanted to do things right, how would that have concrete effects on the design of the study, the hypothesis of the study, the conduct of the study, the analysis of the study? There wasn't room or time in the report to actually demonstrate that very extensively. There is one example, which I think I have over there. There's 4 copies, that's all I could bring, in which we tried to do that. We had several stories from patients, and we had at least one researcher comment on what he would make of that. And if I can, maybe a little less discussion, a little more of this, I don't know. Do we have, yeah. Okay, so if I could just say a word about that. The stories in that section, one of them comes from Health Talk Online. One of them comes from the Informed Medical Decisions Foundation, and one of them was generated out of this project, so I'm saying it's coming from PCORI. The stories in that section at least had a common theme, that the patient-reported outcome measures used in different diseases, in cancer, breast cancer treatment, and in fibromyalgia, don't really capture how the patients we featured there feel about what's really going on. They don't feel the measures. So we included some examples of how you might deal with that in actually measuring outcomes in a study. And we included a commentary from one of the other members of the methodology committee, Ethan Bosch, who read the stories and had some comments about what should we do with this, because he's an expert in patient-reported outcomes in cancer. I don't have much more to say except to sort of identify that the story there from Sarah, sorry, not the story there, but that we also have examples from the missing data section of the report. And the story in the missing data section of Sarah is about somebody who wanted to take part in research, actually enrolled in a study, and eventually dropped out. And I just wanted to say as my sort of last piece that as we looked at sources of narratives or stories, we really didn't find a resource anywhere like healthtalkonline.org. And I thought it's, which is a collection right now of narratives of over 50 illnesses and health conditions linked in one online database. So I won't have time to sort of, this one what? We can do that. We can do that later if we need to. I got the thing queued up. I just wanted to end by saying this, that we are starting a version of Health Talk Online in the United States. The Health Talk Online's funder is called DIPEX. It's a foundation, and DIPEX International is groups like ours that get help from them in starting similar resources in other countries. So we may get more to it in the discussion right away, but I did want to end on that. Yes, thanks. Right.
Yeah, you, for the recording.
I have a huge interest in this because I care about all people being part of the meta-analysis that Cochrane does. I also care about getting socio and behavioral variables into the research that is done. And I think that we often as methodologists, and I said we as if I was a methodologist, that we as methodologists think that the most important things to measure are the things that we can measure. And unfortunately, that can leave us with some important things to consider, but they're not always the only things to consider, and they're often not the most important things to consider. So I'm wondering about involving survivors, consumers, citizens in the beginnings of research, in forming the research questions, in participating all the way through to the dissemination of the results, and which may involve some training, but I think the learning would happen both from the scientist perspective and from the citizen's perspective, and I was wondering what you thought of that.
Well, I mean, first thing is I think that evidence goes hand in hand with patient experiences, and that you mentioned Cochrane reviews, that somebody years ago envisioned that every Cochrane review would be accompanied by some collection of health experiences similar to what you find on Health Talk Online. Largely because of PCORI, people applying to PCORI, they want to get as I said, they want to get the patient's voice into research, but they have to do it, or they tend to do it in a convenient way that doesn't represent all the voices. So you find some volunteers to be in a focus group. There's nothing wrong with focus groups. They're a very legitimate qualitative methodology, but they're the people who want to come forward and talk in public, or at least in a setting where there's other people, and they may not represent every possible view or every possible aspect of it. And I don't think it's important to be representative in the sense that we might say quantitatively representative, but we need to be representative enough that everybody who looks at it can see something of their experience reflected in what is, sort of in the findings of those interactions. So I think engagement at all these stages, which is what PCORI's emphasized, which you mentioned, is really important. I think that people's life stories complements that. In the VA right now, we're doing a similar study where we're obtaining interviews we're interviewing people with traumatic brain injury about trying to reintegrate into society. And I'll tell you, very few of those people want to be advocates, want to be in a setting where there's other people around, especially people who haven't experienced exactly what they've experienced. They may be more comfortable in a one-on-one interview. They may be more comfortable not being involved later, but they wanted to get their story out. Someone needs to help their experiences be brought on to the stage along with those who are more able to be articulate about what's going on, especially especially for a condition like traumatic brain injury that can compromise your communication ability. So I agree with what you're saying. I think my sense of it is that we have to do both. We have to have engagement, but we also have to have a methodology for hearing all viewpoints. And experiences are the key to that. It's not what's your opinion on this. It's, tell us what happened to you when you first felt something was wrong and taking through what decisions you had to make and so on. Pretty free-form questions in those interviews. Yes. Yeah.
So I was really happy that you included caregivers. That's a great idea. I want to suggest, and my organization, Annie Appleseed Project, has done this for years. We don't call people's stories. We call it patient-centered evidence, because they're telling us their case studies. We give docs respect when they tell one story. We call it a case study. I think people's stories should be called patient-centered evidence. It's the real truth of what they experienced.
Did you? I'm not sure who's. I guess we need a mic here. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Is this on?
Yeah.
So I'm Lorraine Johnson, and I serve on the as a patient representative on the Patient Engagement Advisory Panel for PCORI. And one of the things that we did there was we developed a research engagement rubric, which I think is really a nice model. But essentially what it says is that patients should be involved at the time the research question is formed. They should be involved in selecting the sample population. They should be involved in selecting the intervention. They should be involved in selecting the outcomes that are deemed to be important. They should be involved in helping do the analysis of the study, the translation from the findings to conclusions, and they should be involved in helping to disseminate that information. And I think it's a terrific rubric. I was really happy to be part of it. But I think that it is still a challenge culturally getting researchers on board with getting patient involvement. And a lot of times you do see what we've been talking about a little bit here, which is sort of like the convenient sample of patients. You know, somebody who's easy to squeeze into your existing model of a research study. I think PCORI's got the opportunity to change a lot of that because it's a funding organization. So, you know, to the extent that you're requiring more robust engagement with patients, that does start to change culture, I believe, which is one of the things I think is important that's going on there.
Yeah, I can comment on that. I think the culture is changing. I think PCORI, it's clear to me that that's happening because of PCORI. And I don't think that involvement at every stage of the research is even in dispute for most, at least for all prospective studies. Everybody wants to do that. I think there's a gap in skill, and like I said, there's also a gap in reach, or as maybe you said, there's also a gap in reach, who you can reach. I know that if I have a patient on the wards, and I have talked to hundreds of patients with diabetes, but if I have a new patient with diabetes and an intern or a student that's new, I would like them to go and look at the results of a qualitative study where people have interviewed to saturation as many people to represent things as they can, and look through the themes and the excerpts and the quotes from that, not just rely on the last few patients we saw, to really understand the context and the voice of the patient in that disease. And even, so that's for the sampling problem, and you know, the skill problem is the next big thing to tackle. Can the researchers turn all this engagement and turn all this involvement into something that answers the question, that you eventually know whether A or B, how A and B compare, because you've got the right comparisons, the right outcomes, the right patient populations, and the right design and the right statistical methods and all of that. That's where the methodology committee is most focused, is how do we prepare, how do we get that to happen, not just the engagement, but the results of the engagement, its impact on design and conduct and analysis and reporting of studies.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, sometimes
That wasn't it, though, right?
You look at the phrase patient stories, and you know, the context could be research, as you're talking about it, but it also could be patients that have been harmed through an adverse event in a hospital. Okay, is that better? Okay. I think it's estimated now in like the IOM study, which said about 99,000 people are harmed a year or die a year from medical errors. I think it's up to about 400,000. So there's a lot of issues involving patient safety improvement in this country. Would PCORI entertain a research study using patient stories in a systematic way in the context of medical harm to look in terms of whether there was a root cause analysis, did the person sued, did the hospital make an offer before the person sued, issues like that in terms of the impact of medical harm and what improvements were made as a result of that.
Well, I certainly can't say what PCORI would or wouldn't be interested in funding. However, we do have a person who is on the staff of PCORI here who's speaking later who might be able to answer a question like that. But I would say this, that where collections of stories, and they're not just, you know, random collections of stories, they're carefully analyzed to look for themes and to bring those out. But where that's been done, in, let's say, in the UK, it's been used, that body of work has been used for a lot of purposes. They've been used to for item selection, for instruments to measure patient-reported outcomes. They've been used to help get ideas for or implement ideas for system redesign. They've been used in training of students and residents. As I said, they've been used in many different ways. The idea of using those stories to bring out sort of what are the side effects, what are the pros and cons of this, is probably much more done in the Foundation for Informed Decision Making, which tries to use essentially videos to bring out what it's like to live with the side effects of different treatment alternatives. The equivalent of the drug agencies in the UK would find this a very rich source of information, and I would say, and I defer to Kay on this, but certainly part of the origins of Health Talk Online was exactly that, because people going into these things and talking to a physician with, let's say, a new diagnosis of breast cancer probably couldn't get the same sort of perspective on the what it's like to live with that disease, or what things might happen to you from, you know, that kind of information as you could from saturation interviewing and pulling out the themes. And I'd also say that the FDA and groups like that might be interested in something like that, which Dr. Dickerson is working on. Is that yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
This overlaps with the last question and answer. When you gave the example of making sure that the stories were not biased and that they didn't promote a particular drug or company, I, of course, assumed that you also meant they didn't criticize a particular drug or company, that it would be either side. But I was curious as to whether that omission of just talking about the promotion is a reflection of the voices that are being heard. And that's the impression that I get, is that for a variety of reasons, many of the patient advocates are talking about, we need new drugs, we need drugs that work better, we need them faster, that they're focused in one direction, and that drug companies and other interested parties are supporting those efforts, and I'm wondering if, in your experience, these issues that you're working on in terms of PCORI and methodology are hearing from the other side of the patients who've been harmed from side effects, or the caregivers whose loved ones die.
Well, I got to ask you. You're asking if PCORI's hearing that, right? Yeah.
If your work on the methodology committee, if that's part of the issues that you're dealing with because you're hearing about them from the patients. Maybe you're not hearing from the patients.
No, I don't think the methodology committee is hearing as much directly from the patients. When we did this, we managed to get the methodology committee to approve a small group of us to go out and not be biased, not collect stories in an unbiased way. And you'll find in the report stories that touch on the complications of the hip replacements that's well known and so on. I agree with what you say about advocacy groups. I don't know what PCORI is doing to try to counter that tendency. I do know that if you take a condition like bad hip, bad knee, diabetes, or any other condition, and you do the right thing of going out and really trying to find out patients' experiences, you're going to come across a lot of people who have harms. And you're not necessarily going to hear their voices if the groups you're talking to really, as you say, are lobbying primarily for new, better drugs. They should be lobbying for new, better drugs for various reasons, but they're not representative of the experiences people have had with that illness.
Sorry to cut off this great discussion, but thank you, Mark, and we'll move on.